On the edge of a quiet Canadian town, where the trees stand like black sentinels against the winter sky, there is a stretch of land that once carried the weight of steel and ambition. The railway is long gone now, its tracks ripped from the earth, its engines fallen silent. But something still moves out there. On certain nights, when the wind sinks low and the world feels older than it should, a single light glides along the abandoned railbed, pale, steady, searching. Some call it a trick of the air. Others swear it's the lantern of a man who died begging for justice he never received, a man broken by the machine he served. Tonight, we follow that light, and we uncover the story of a worker forgotten by history, but remembered by the dead. The first person to see it, or at least the first to admit it publicly, was a farmer named Douglas MacLeod. The year was 1913, just 3 months after the accident. He'd been driving his wagon home along the old trail that ran parallel to the tracks when he saw it, a light bobbing in the darkness ahead, moving with the steady rhythm of a man walking. At first he thought it was another traveler. The light swung low, as if carried in someone's hand, and it moved with purpose, following the railbed north toward the junction. MacLeod called out. No answer came. He urged his horses forward, curious now, perhaps a little concerned. But as he drew closer, the light simply vanished, not extinguished, not hidden behind trees or terrain. It was there, and then it was not, as if it had never existed at all. MacLeod told his wife that night that he'd seen something unnatural. She told him he'd been drinking, but within weeks others began to report the same phenomenon. Railway workers finishing late shifts, teenagers daring each other to walk the tracks after dark, a priest returning from a sick call. All of them described the same thing, a pale yellowish light, the color of an old kerosene lantern, moving steadily along the abandoned section of track where the accident had occurred. Some said it swung back and forth, as if the person carrying it was searching for something. Others claimed it moved in a straight line, unwavering, like a man who knew exactly where he was going. The light appeared most often on cold nights, nights when the temperature dropped below freezing and the air grew so still you could hear the creak of trees half a mile away. Nights that felt like the one when he died. St. Louis, Saskatchewan, is not a place that announces itself. Even in its prime, it was barely more than a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a railway junction, a necessary stop on the Canadian Northern Railway's ambitious push across the western frontier. The town existed because the railway needed it to exist, and when the railway decided it no longer did, St. Louis began its slow fade into memory. But in the early years of the 20th century, St. Louis mattered. The railway was more than infrastructure. It was the iron spine of a young nation's dream. Tracks stretched across impossible distances, connecting isolated communities, hauling grain and timber and settlers westward into territories that had, until recently, belonged to no one but the Cree and the open sky. The work was brutal. Men died building those tracks, frozen in winter blizzards, crushed by machinery, broken by exhaustion. The companies kept poor records of such deaths. Workers were often transients, immigrants, men whose names appeared on no official documents. When they died, they were buried quickly and quietly, their families, if they had them, left to fend for themselves. The railway companies operated with the callous efficiency of empire. Deadlines mattered more than safety. Profits trumped precaution. Managers faced constant pressure from distant executives who saw only numbers on ledgers, not the human cost of meeting quotas in sub-zero temperatures with inadequate equipment. In this context, a single death was unremarkable, expected even, the cost of progress. But some deaths echo louder than others. Why does the light appear? Ask this question in St. Louis today, and you'll receive different answers depending on who's speaking. The elderly will tell you it's the ghost of a railway worker, murdered or abandoned, still walking his rounds with his lantern held high. The middle-aged might offer scientific explanations, reflections from distant car headlights, swamp gas, atmospheric phenomena they don't fully understand, but trust must have rational causes. The young simply call it the St. Louis light, as if it were a natural feature of the landscape, like the river or the northern lights. They've grown up with the story, absorbed it as part of the town's identity. To them, it's less a question to be answered than a presence to be acknowledged. But beneath the folklore and the skepticism lies something more unsettling, The question of why this ghost? Why this stretch of track? Why this particular death when so many others went unmarked and unmourned? The answer, like most truths about violence and injustice, is uncomfortable. To understand the ghost, we must understand the man. Not the legend that formed around his death, but the actual human being who walked those tracks, carried that lantern, and died in circumstances that were never adequately explained. We must understand what it meant to be a railway worker in that era, the pride and the fear, the small dignities and the daily humiliations, the way a man could be both essential and disposable in the same breath. We must understand the machinery of neglect that ground him down, the economic pressures that made his death convenient, and the institutional indifference that tried to erase him from memory. His name, according to what few records remain, was Tom Dunn. He was 27 years old. He had a wife named Catherine and a daughter who had just learned to walk. He'd been working for the Canadian Northern Railway for 4 years, promoted from track maintenance to brakeman, a position of modest responsibility and slightly better pay. On the night of August 16, 1913, Tom Dunn went to work expecting to return home the following morning, as he had done hundreds of times before. He never did. What happened on the tracks that night would haunt St. Louis for more than a century. But before we examine his death, we must first understand his life. Because a ghost, after all, is just a memory that refuses to rest. And some memories have good reason to remain restless. Tom Dunn was not remarkable. That's important to understand. He was not a hero, not a rebel, not a man marked by destiny or drama. He was simply someone trying to build a life in a hard country during a hard time, doing work that needed doing for wages that barely covered the cost of survival. He'd come to Saskatchewan from Ontario 5 years earlier, part of the great wave of migration that followed the railway's expansion. Back east, there was nothing for him. No land, no prospects, only the cramped certainty of remaining poor. The West promised opportunity, or at least the possibility of it. A man could work, save, perhaps buy a small piece of land, perhaps build something that would outlast him. Catherine had been reluctant to leave. She'd grown up in a town where everyone knew everyone, where her family had roots going back 3 generations. Moving west meant leaving behind everything familiar for a place that existed mostly in government pamphlets and railway advertisements. But she'd loved Tom, and she'd seen the hunger in him, not for wealth, but for dignity, for the chance to be something more than a day laborer, living on the margins of someone else's prosperity. So they'd gone, first to Winnipeg, where Tom found work on the rail yards, then further west to St. Louis when the Canadian Northern Railway began expanding its operations in the region. The pay was better than anything he'd earned in Ontario. The work was harder, but Tom was young and strong, and he'd grown up understanding that a man's value was measured by his endurance. By 1913, they'd been in St. Louis for 3 years. They rented a small house on the edge of town, nothing special, but it had a wood stove that worked and enough room for the 3 of them. Catherine took in sewing to supplement Tom's wages. Their daughter, Mary, was 18 months old, walking now, beginning to form words. They were not comfortable, but they were managing. In that time and place, managing was enough. Tom had been promoted to brakeman the previous year. It was a sign of trust, of competence. Brakemen were responsible for coupling and uncoupling cars, setting handbrakes, signaling to the engineer. It required quick thinking, physical strength, and constant vigilance. The work was dangerous. A moment of inattention could cost you fingers, a hand, your life, but it paid 30 cents more per day than track maintenance. 30 cents could buy a lot. Flour, sugar, fabric for a dress Catherine had been wanting. Over a month, it added up to something that felt like progress. Tom took the job seriously. He showed up on time, followed procedures, didn't drink on shift like some of the other men. He wanted that reputation, the steady worker, the reliable one, because reliability, he understood, was how a man like him survived. The railway didn't care about you, but it cared about efficiency. If you were useful, you stayed employed. If you weren't, there were 100 other men waiting to take your place. The work culture on the Canadian Northern Railway was shaped by contradiction. The companies presented themselves as builders of civilization, bringing progress and prosperity to the frontier. But the men who actually did the work understood a different truth. They were expendable components in a vast mechanical system that valued them only slightly more than it valued the steel rails they maintained. Safety equipment was minimal. Procedures existed on paper, but were often ignored under pressure to meet schedules. The men developed their own informal rules, ways of watching out for each other, signals that meant danger, superstitions that might seem foolish but carried the weight of experience. Tom learned these unwritten codes quickly. He learned which foreman would listen if you pointed out a hazard, and which would tell you to shut up and do your job. He learned how to read the weather, how to spot a rail that had contracted too much in the cold and might snap under load. He learned that the moment between cars coupling was when most injuries happened, and he developed a way of timing his movements that kept him clear of the crushing weight of iron meeting iron. He also learned about the hierarchy. The engineers and conductors who ran the trains were employees, yes, but they occupied a different social stratum than the brakemen and maintenance workers. They had regular salaries, not day wages. They wore clean clothes and lived in better houses. When they spoke to management, they were listened to. The men like Tom, the brakemen, the track workers, the laborers who did the physical work that kept the system running, existed in a different category entirely. They were addressed by their last names or not at all. Their complaints were dismissed. Their deaths were attributed to carelessness, regardless of circumstances. There was a pecking order even among the workers. The older men, those who'd survived a decade or more on the rails, commanded respect. They'd earned it by simply not dying, not losing limbs, not breaking under the grinding repetition of dangerous labor. The younger men learned from them, watched how they moved, listened to their warnings. Tom occupied a middle position, no longer green, not yet a veteran, competent enough to be trusted with brakeman duties, but not senior enough to have real influence. It was a precarious place to be, responsible for safety, but lacking the authority to refuse unsafe work. The trouble began in the spring of 1913, though Tom didn't recognize it as trouble at first. The railway was facing financial pressure. The expansion had been expensive, and revenues weren't meeting projections. Word came down from management. Cut costs, maintenance budgets were trimmed, hiring slowed. The workers who remained were expected to do more with less. Small things began to slip. Brake shoes that should have been replaced were patched and reused. Lanterns ran on cheaper oil that burned with a dimmer, less reliable flame. Track inspections that had been conducted weekly became monthly. The foreman who'd once been willing to halt operations for safety concerns now faced pressure to keep trains running on schedule, regardless. Tom noticed. The other workers noticed. They complained among themselves in the tired, cynical way of men who'd learned that complaining changes nothing. A few of the older hands approached management directly, pointing out specific hazards. They were told the company appreciated their vigilance, but that current conditions were perfectly adequate. One afternoon in July, Tom was working a coupling when the mechanism jammed. The cars were rolling together with momentum, and his hand was caught between the coupling and the buffer. For 3 seconds, an eternity, he couldn't free himself. He could see the metal closing, could feel the pressure building. At the last moment, the coupling gave way, and he pulled his hand free. His fingers were bruised but not broken. But the fear stayed with him. That night, he told Catherine what had happened. She asked if he could find other work. He said there was no other work, not that paid enough to live on. She asked if he could talk to his supervisor about the faulty equipment. He said he already had, and been told to be more careful. "They don't care, Kathy," he'd said, and she'd heard something in his voice she'd never heard before. Not anger, not even resignation, but a kind of weary knowledge. The knowledge that he was valuable only insofar as he remained useful, and that if he pushed too hard, there were other men who would take his place and keep their mouths shut. In the days leading up to August 16th, Tom Dunn carried a feeling he couldn't quite name. Not quite dread, not quite foreboding. More like the sense that something was off balance, tilting towards some inevitable conclusion. The weather had been strange that week, unseasonably cold for mid-August, with heavy morning fogs that didn't burn off until noon. The men joked darkly about it. Winter coming early, a bad omen. The kind of thing that presaged disaster in the old stories. On the 15th, Tom's regular shift was canceled due to a scheduling conflict. He was told to report the following night instead, for the late run, the one that left St. Louis at 11 p.m. and ran north to the junction at Prince Albert. It was a milk run technically, a mixed freight and passenger service that made frequent stops. but it was also known as one of the more dangerous shifts because it operated in darkness, through remote stretches where help was hours away if something went wrong. Tom mentioned to Catherine that he had a bad feeling about the shift. Not a premonition, nothing so dramatic. Just an unease. She asked if he could call in sick. He reminded her that missing a shift without cause meant losing a day's pay, and possibly losing the job entirely if the foreman took offense. So, on the evening of August 16th, Tom Dunn kissed his wife and daughter goodbye, picked up his work lantern, a battered kerosene lamp with a wire handle, and walked to the rail yard. It was just after 10 p.m. The temperature had dropped below freezing despite it being summer, his breath fogged in the air. He arrived to find the yard in controlled chaos. The train was running behind schedule due to a mechanical issue with the locomotive. The manager on duty, a man named Hartley, known for his rigid adherence to company policy and his contempt for worker complaints, was visibly agitated. He needed the train to depart on time to avoid further delays down the line. Tom and the other brakeman, a veteran named Josiah Webb, did their pre-departure inspections as quickly as possible. Everything seemed functional, if not ideal. The brakes were adequate, the couplings held. The lanterns worked. At 11:30 p.m., 90 minutes behind schedule, the train departed St. Louis heading north. Tom stood on the rear platform of the last car, lantern in hand, watching the town's lights recede into darkness. It was the last time anyone saw him alive. The night of August 16, 1913, was brutally cold. Not the clean, crisp cold of winter, but the damp, invasive chill of a late summer frost that settles into your bones and won't leave. Fog hung in the low places, thick enough to swallow sound. Visibility was poor, maybe 50 feet in the clear stretches, less than 20 where the fog pooled. These were dangerous conditions for running a freight train, particularly at night. Standard procedure called for reduced speed and extra caution, but the train was already 90 minutes behind schedule, and Hartley had made it clear that further delays were unacceptable. The engineer, a taciturn man named Kowalski, had protested mildly, noted the poor visibility, the cold that could make metal brittle, and brakes less responsive. Hartley had told him to do his job, so they had departed. Tom Dunn on the rear platform, lantern in hand. Josiah Webb stationed mid-train, the engineer and fireman in the locomotive, 6 freight cars and 1 passenger coach, carrying maybe a dozen travelers too tired or too poor to care that the train was running late through questionable conditions. For the first hour, nothing went wrong. The train moved at a steady, if cautious pace through the darkness. Tom performed his duties mechanically, watching for signals, checking that the rear coupling held secure, maintaining awareness of the train's position and speed. The cold bit through his coat. The lantern cast a small circle of yellow light that seemed to make the surrounding darkness even deeper. They made their first stop at a small settlement called Birch Hills. A few passengers disembarked. Mail and parcels were loaded. The whole process took maybe 15 minutes. When they departed again, the fog had grown thicker. 10 miles north of Birch Hills, the terrain changed. The track entered a stretch of forest where the trees pressed close on both sides, blocking what little ambient light came from the stars. Here, the railroad had carved a corridor through dense wilderness, and the isolation was absolute. If something went wrong in this section, the nearest help was an hour away in either direction. It was in this section, approximately 3 miles south of the junction, where the line split toward Prince Albert and Melfort, that the accident occurred. What exactly happened remains disputed. The official report, issued by the Canadian Northern Railway 3 days after the incident, attributed the accident to worker negligence and failure to maintain proper positioning. But the official report was brief, perfunctory, and contradicted by nearly every witness who testified informally in the days and weeks that followed. What we know for certain: at approximately 1:45 a.m., the train made an unscheduled stop. The engineer later claimed he'd stopped because he felt unusual resistance in the locomotive, as if something was dragging or caught on the tracks. He'd signaled the stop with 3 short whistle blasts, the standard code for emergency, remain at stations. Tom Dunn, standing on the rear platform, would have heard the whistle and felt the train beginning to slow. Protocol required him to set the rear brakes once the train came to a complete stop, then walk forward along the length of the cars to determine the cause of the halt and receive instructions from the engineer. According to Josiah Webb, who was stationed midway along the train, Tom did exactly that. Webb saw his lantern light moving forward, bobbing in the darkness as Tom walked along the narrow space between the train and the forest edge. The light passed Webb's position, moving toward the locomotive. Then Webb heard voices, sharp, raised, though he couldn't make out words. He assumed Tom had reached the engineer and they were discussing the problem. The voices continued for perhaps 30 seconds. Then silence. Then a sound Webb would describe repeatedly in the weeks that followed. Not a scream, not a shout, but a brief, truncated cry that was cut off almost before it began. The sound of a man in sudden, catastrophic distress who didn't have time to articulate what was happening to him. Webb called out. No response. He began moving forward, his own lantern held high. The engineer emerged from the locomotive, asking what had happened. Together they moved along the train, calling Tom's name. They found his body 30 feet north of the locomotive, lying between the tracks. The body was not whole. The details of Tom Dunn's death are not pleasant, but they matter. They matter because the nature of his injuries tells us something about what happened, and about the efforts made afterward to obscure the truth. Tom's head and right arm had been severed from his body. The severing was clean, consistent with the weight and pressure of train wheels. But here's what troubled the witnesses. Tom's body was positioned between the tracks, not on them. For a train to have run over him, he would have needed to be lying across the rails. But he wasn't. Josiah Webb, who'd worked railways for 15 years, later said the positioning made no sense. If Tom had slipped and fallen under the wheels while the train was moving, his body would have been dragged along the tracks, not deposited neatly between them. If he'd been struck by the locomotive, his body would have been in front of the engine, not beside it. The injuries suggested he'd been caught by the wheels while standing between the tracks, but the train had been stationary. The only way for that to happen would be if the train had unexpectedly lurched forward while he was standing there, or if he'd been pushed. Tom's lantern was found 20 feet from his body, still burning, the glass chimney cracked but intact. The position of the lantern suggested it had been dropped or thrown, not simply fallen. The engineer, Kowalski, insisted the locomotive had not moved after the initial stop. He'd set the brakes and remained in the cabin. The only person who could have released the brakes was him, and he swore he hadn't. But Hartley, the manager, had been on the train that night. He'd ridden in the passenger coach, ostensibly to oversee the delayed run. Multiple witnesses later reported seeing him near the locomotive after the train stopped. When asked about this, Hartley claimed he'd gone forward to discuss the delay with the engineer. He insisted he'd been in the locomotive cabin when the accident occurred and knew nothing about it until he heard Webb calling out. The timeline made this story questionable. The distance from the passenger coach to the locomotive was significant. The time between the train stopping and Tom's death was perhaps 2 minutes. For Hartley to have reached the locomotive, spoken with the engineer, and been present when Tom died, he would have needed to move very quickly through poor visibility on uncertain footing, or he would have needed to be already near the locomotive when Tom approached. By dawn, company officials had descended on the scene. Not investigators, but managers, men whose primary concern was limiting liability and preventing scandal. The body was removed quickly, wrapped in canvas, loaded onto the train. The blood was washed from the tracks with snow and water. The train resumed its journey within 4 hours of the accident. No formal investigation was conducted. No outside authority was notified. The company doctor examined the body and declared the death accidental, worker error, a tragic but not uncommon occurrence on the railways. Tom's lantern was not preserved as evidence. The section of track where he died was not photographed or measured. Josiah Webb was told firmly that his testimony wasn't needed, and that discussing the incident with anyone outside the company would result in immediate dismissal. The official report, dated August 19, 1913, ran to less than 2 pages. It stated that Tom Dunn, brakeman, had violated protocol by walking between the tracks while the train was in motion. It expressed regret at the loss and reminded all employees of the importance of following safety procedures. There was no mention of the poor visibility, the rush to depart despite conditions, or the presence of manager Hartley near the locomotive. There was no mention of the voices Josiah Webb had heard, or the suspicious positioning of Tom's body. Catherine Dunn received no death benefit, no compensation. The railway informed her that because Tom's death was attributed to his own negligence, the company bore no financial responsibility. She was given his final week's wages, minus deductions for his uniform and equipment that would not be returned. She had $43 to her name, an 18-month-old daughter, and a husband's body that would be buried in the St. Louis cemetery with no headstone because she couldn't afford one. The injustice of this was not lost on the workers. They knew Tom Dunn. They knew he was careful, experienced, not the kind of man who made careless mistakes. They also knew that raising objections would accomplish nothing except making them targets for dismissal. So, they buried Tom, and they went back to work, and they tried not to think too hard about what had happened. But the silence felt wrong. It felt like complicity. And then, 3 weeks after Tom Dunn was buried, someone saw his lantern moving on the tracks. The first sighting after the burial came from a maintenance worker named Sullivan, a hard-bitten Irishman not given to fancy or superstition. He'd been walking the line just after sunset, checking for loose spikes when he saw it ahead of him. A light moving steadily along the tracks, about 300 yards distant. Sullivan assumed it was another worker and called out. The light continued moving. He walked faster, curious now. The light maintained its distance. Sullivan broke into a jog, but the faster he moved, the faster the light seemed to move, always staying just out of reach. Then it stopped. Sullivan stopped too, catching his breath. He watched the light hover there, swinging slightly like a lantern held in someone's hand. He called out again, "Who's there?" The light began moving toward him, not quickly, not threateningly, just steadily, deliberately, closing the distance. And as it came closer, Sullivan felt something he'd never experienced before on the tracks. Fear. Deep, instinctive fear that had nothing to do with rational thought and everything to do with the cold certainty that what he was seeing was wrong, impossible, not of this world. He ran. He was not ashamed of this. He would tell the story many times in the years that followed, always with the same firm insistence. I ran, and any man with sense would have done the same. When he reached the rail yard, he found other workers and told them what he'd seen. They laughed at first, then stopped laughing when they saw how shaken he was. Sullivan was not a man who scared easily. Within a week, 3 more workers reported similar sightings. Always the same location, the stretch of track between St. Louis and the junction where Tom had died. Always the same description, a pale yellowish light moving with purpose, appearing and disappearing without warning. The workers began to whisper. Some said it was Tom, still walking his rounds, still carrying his lantern. Others said it was a warning that Tom's death hadn't been an accident, and his spirit wouldn't rest until someone acknowledged the truth. The managers dismissed these reports as hysteria, the product of guilt and overactive imaginations. They threatened to fire anyone caught spreading ghost stories that might damage the railway's reputation. But the sightings continued, and they weren't confined to railway workers anymore. Locals began reporting the light too. People who'd never heard about Tom Dunn's death, who knew nothing about the circumstances, saw the same phenomenon and described it in remarkably consistent terms. The light became something the town couldn't ignore, couldn't dismiss. It became part of St. Louis's identity, an unexplained presence that forced everyone who saw it to confront questions they'd rather avoid. Questions about what they'd allowed to happen, about their silence, about whether a man's death could be so casually erased, or whether some debts persist beyond the grave. By the winter of 1913, the St. Louis light had become an established phenomenon. It appeared most frequently on clear, cold nights, the kind of nights when the air is so still that sound carries for miles and the darkness feels absolute. Those who saw it described a consistency that defied easy explanation. Always the same stretch of track, always the same pale yellow glow, always moving with the deliberate pace of a man walking. The railway tried to suppress discussion of the light. But gossip travels faster than trains. Workers who transferred to other lines carried the story with them. Passengers who'd heard about the sightings came to St. Louis specifically hoping to see it. The light became part of the town's folklore before it had even been a year since Tom Dunn's death. What's striking about these early accounts is their lack of embellishment. In later years, the story would accumulate dramatic details. Claims that the light chased people, that it appeared in response to calling Tom's name, that it could be seen holding a severed head. But in those first months and years, the descriptions remained almost clinical. a light moving along the abandoned section of track, appearing without warning and vanishing just as suddenly. Railway managers, desperate to provide a rational explanation, attempted several investigations. They checked for natural gas deposits that might cause luminescence. They searched for reflective surfaces that might catch and amplify distant lights. They timed the appearances to see if they correlated with train schedules from neighboring lines. Nothing fit. The light appeared on nights when no trains were running within 20 miles. It manifested in weather conditions that would have dispersed swamp gas or atmospheric phenomena. It followed the track line precisely, even after the tracks themselves were removed in sections for maintenance. One investigator, a railway engineer named Patterson, who approached the matter with determined skepticism, spent 3 nights on the tracks with surveying equipment and a notebook. On the 3rd night, he saw the light himself, watched it approach to within 20 feet of his position before winking out like a candle flame. His official report stated only that he had observed a luminous phenomenon requiring further study. Privately, he told colleagues he'd felt such overwhelming dread in those final moments before the light disappeared that he'd been unable to move or speak. He never returned to investigate further. As the years passed, the story of the St. Louis light evolved from a strange occurrence into a proper legend. The transformation followed a pattern familiar to folklorists, a kernel of historical truth wrapped in layers of interpretation, meaning, and moral weight. Tom Dunn's name became attached to the light, though in the early years many people saw the light without knowing whose ghost it supposedly represented. Catherine Dunn had left St. Louis within a year of Tom's death, unable to bear living in the town where he'd died and where the railway had discarded them both. She'd taken Mary and moved east, back to Ontario, where family could help support them. The town forgot her, but it remembered the light. The story that crystallized went like this. Tom Dunn had been a good man, a hard worker, murdered or allowed to die through management negligence. His death had been covered up, his widow denied compensation. Now his ghost walked the tracks, carrying his lantern, searching for the justice he'd been denied in life. The light was both a haunting and an accusation, evidence that the railway's sins could not be buried, along with the bodies of the men it had killed. This narrative served multiple purposes. For the workers, it validated their suspicions about Tom's death and gave voice to their anger about working conditions. For the town, it became a way of acknowledging collective guilt, the silence they had maintained, the questions they hadn't asked. For outsiders, it became a gothic romance, a ghost story that combined tragedy and injustice in equal measure. Churches preached sermons about it, not about ghosts, which remain theologically problematic, but about the moral implications of Tom's story, about how a society that allows workers to die in unsafe conditions and denies their families justice creates spiritual debts that cannot be avoided or forgotten. The light became a symbol larger than itself. Every worker who died on the railways, every family left destitute, every cover-up and denial, all of it found expression in that single pale lantern moving through the darkness. The persistence of the sightings attracted attention beyond St. Louis. In the 1920s and 30s, as automobiles became more common and roads were built near the old railway line, more people had opportunities to see the light. Sightings increased, and with them came renewed efforts to provide scientific explanations. The most popular theory involved vehicle headlights. Skeptics argued that the light was simply the reflection or refraction of car headlights from a distant highway, distorted by atmospheric conditions to appear closer than it actually was. This explanation was tidy, rational, and appealed to modern sensibilities that preferred mechanical explanations to supernatural ones. But it didn't hold up under scrutiny. Investigators demonstrated that the light appeared on nights when no traffic was visible for miles. It manifested before the relevant highway was even constructed. It moved in ways inconsistent with stationary reflected light, not just horizontally along the track, but occasionally up and down, as if the carrier was traversing uneven ground. Other theories emerged: ball lightning, phosphorescent fungi, piezoelectric effects from compressed quartz in the soil. Each theory explained some aspects of the phenomenon, but failed to account for others. Ball lightning is rare and short-lived. The St. Louis light could persist for hours. Fungi don't move. Piezoelectric effects don't follow railway lines. A university professor named Lederer conducted extensive studies in 1936, setting up cameras and measuring equipment along the track. He captured photographs of the light, blurry, inconclusive, but undeniably showing something luminous in the expected location. His measurements showed no electromagnetic anomalies, no radiation, no heat signature. The light, according to his instruments, didn't physically exist, but it was visible to the naked eye, could be photographed, and produce consistent testimony from dozens of unrelated witnesses. Lederer concluded his study with admirable honesty. I cannot explain what we observed. I can only confirm that we observed something. The scientific investigations, rather than dismissing the light, gave it legitimacy. Here was a phenomenon that couldn't be easily dismissed as superstition or hysteria. Something real was happening on those tracks, even if its nature remained beyond explanation. By the 1950s, the St. Louis light had become a cornerstone of the town's identity. The railway was gone. The Canadian Northern had been absorbed into other companies. The line through St. Louis eventually abandoned as more efficient routes were established. The physical infrastructure that had given the town its reason for existence had disappeared. The tracks were pulled up, sold for scrap. The station building stood empty, then collapsed. But the light remained. This permanence gave it cultural weight. St. Louis could have faded into complete obscurity, another prairie town that lost its purpose when the railway moved on. Instead, it became known for the light. People came from across Saskatchewan, from Manitoba and Alberta, to park along the old railbed and wait for the phenomenon to appear. The town embraced this identity with a mixture of pride and unease. Local businesses sold postcards depicting an artistic rendering of the ghost light. The annual fair featured displays about the history of the railway and Tom Dunn's story. But there was always an undercurrent of discomfort, a recognition that they were profiting, however modestly, from a man's death and the injustice that followed it. Children grew up with the light as part of their landscape. They'd dare each other to walk the old railbed at night, to see who could get closest to the light before fear drove them back. Teenagers used it as a backdrop for courtship, parking along the access roads, half watching for the light while navigating the complicated territory of young desire. The light became woven into personal histories. I was there the night Mary saw the light became a way of marking time, of establishing shared experience. Families had stories. The night grandmother encountered the light and it followed her for half a mile. The time Uncle John swore he heard a voice calling from the darkness just before the light appeared. These stories, repeated and refined over decades, created a collective memory that transcended individual experience. The light became a living tradition, passed from generation to generation, each retelling adding nuance while maintaining the essential narrative: injustice, death, unrest. In more recent decades, as documentation technology became accessible, the St. Louis light attracted serious paranormal researchers and curious skeptics in equal measure. The testimony they collected reveals both the consistency of the phenomenon and its emotional impact on witnesses. Margaret Thyssen, interviewed in 1987, described seeing the light in 1962 when she was 17. It was September, cold already. My boyfriend and I had driven out there, like kids do. We were sitting in the truck, talking, not really expecting anything. Then I saw it, just a small point of light at first, way down the line. It got brighter as it came closer, and I could see it swaying like someone was carrying it. My boyfriend wanted to drive toward it, but I couldn't. I was terrified in a way I can't explain. It wasn't fear of danger exactly. It was fear of seeing something I wasn't meant to see, something that shouldn't exist. Robert Michaud, a truck driver who encountered the light in 1979. I've driven through every province in this country at all hours of the night. I don't scare easy, but that thing, it wasn't natural. I watched it for maybe 5 minutes, and the whole time I had this feeling like I was intruding on something private, like I was watching someone's grief, and it was wrong to be there. When it disappeared, I felt relieved, but also sad. That's the part I can't explain. Why would a light make me feel sad? Jennifer Wozniak, a paranormal investigator who studied the light in 2003. We spent 4 nights out there with full equipment: EMF readers, thermal cameras, audio recorders. The first 3 nights, nothing. The 4th night, the light appeared around 2 a.m. Our equipment went haywire. The EMF reader spiked to levels that should indicate powerful electrical sources, but there was nothing there. The thermal camera showed a cold spot moving along the track, not just absence of heat, but active cold, colder than the surrounding air. Then all our batteries died simultaneously, every single one. Fresh batteries, different brands, all dead in the same instant. The light stayed for another 10 minutes after that, and we just watched it. No equipment, no documentation, just us and this impossible thing. What's remarkable about these accounts is their emotional consistency. Nearly everyone who sees the light describes feeling not just fear, but sorrow, a sense of witnessing something profoundly sad. Many report an instinctive understanding that the light is searching for something it will never find. Some witnesses report more active encounters, claims that the light responded to being called out to, or that it moved toward observers before suddenly retreating. One account from 1991 describes the light flickering in a pattern that resembled Morse code, though no one present could decipher what, if anything, it was trying to communicate. Skeptics point out the subjective nature of these testimonies, the way emotion and expectation can shape perception, and they're not wrong to be cautious. Human beings are excellent at finding patterns and meaning in ambiguous phenomena. We're storytelling creatures. We need narratives to make sense of experience. But the sheer volume of consistent testimony, spanning more than a century, from witnesses with no connection to each other and no obvious incentive to fabricate, that's harder to dismiss. Something is happening on those tracks. Whether it's Tom Dunn's ghost or some other phenomenon we lack the framework to understand, the light persists. And with it, the question that refuses to go away: what debt remains unpaid? Tom Dunn's story should have ended with his burial. In the ordinary course of history, he would have been forgotten. Another worker whose life and death barely registered in the official record, whose name appeared on no monuments, whose sacrifice contributed to a railway system that never acknowledged his existence mattered. But the light prevented that erasure. For more than a century now, people have been drawn to those tracks, compelled by the persistent phenomenon to ask questions about what happened there. And in asking questions about Tom Dunn, they've been forced to confront larger truths about the era that killed him and the systems that allowed his death to be dismissed so casually. The railway companies that employed Tom are long gone, absorbed into larger corporations or dissolved entirely. The men who managed those companies, who made the decisions that prioritized profit over safety, who covered up worker deaths to avoid liability, they're all dead now, their names forgotten, their legacies dissolved. But Tom Dunn is remembered. His ghost, or whatever the light represents, has ensured that his story survives. In death, he achieved a permanence that his life never afforded him. He became more than a worker, more than a statistic. He became a symbol of every laborer who died building the infrastructure that made modern Canada possible. There's a grim irony in this. Tom wanted simple things: security, dignity, a life where his work meant something. He wanted to be remembered by his family, to build something that would outlast him. Instead, he's remembered by strangers for the manner of his death and the injustice that followed it. His legacy is not what he built, but what was taken from him. And perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps that's the only honest memorial for a man like Tom Dunn. Not a statue or a plaque celebrating his contribution, but a haunting that forces us to reckon with the cost of progress, the human price of ambition, the weight of debts we'd rather forget. St. Louis lives with a contradiction. The town exists in part because of the light. Tourism trickles in, modest, sporadic, but real. People come to see the phenomenon, spend money at local businesses, contribute to the economy. The light is mentioned in travel guides, featured in paranormal television shows, discussed on internet forums. But this attention comes at the cost of acknowledging a foundational sin: the community's silence in 1913 when Tom Dunn was killed and his widow was left with nothing. The workers knew something was wrong. The townspeople heard the rumors, but no one challenged the railway's official narrative. No one demanded an investigation or offered Catherine Dunn material support. This silence wasn't malicious, it was pragmatic. The railway was the town's economic lifeline. Challenging the company meant risking jobs, risking the town's survival. Individual families couldn't afford to take that stand, and collective action seemed impossible when everyone was struggling just to get by. But pragmatism doesn't erase moral weight. The town survived by accepting Tom's death as the cost of doing business. They allowed the railway to define truth, to write the official history, to erase a man's death as if it didn't matter. The light doesn't let them forget this. Older residents of St. Louis, particularly those whose grandparents worked on the railway, carry a particular awareness of this history. They understand that the light isn't just a ghost story or a tourist attraction. It's a reminder of choices their ancestors made, of complicity and silence, of the way ordinary people participate in systemic injustice simply by not resisting it. Some find this burden heavy. Others have made peace with it, arguing that their grandparents did what they had to do to survive, and judging them from a position of modern comfort is unfair. Both perspectives have merit. History is rarely a matter of simple heroes and villains. But the light suggests that forgiveness, if that's even the right word, cannot be assumed. It must be earned. And you don't earn it by forgetting, by moving on, by declaring the past dead and buried. You earn it by remembering, by acknowledging what happened, by ensuring that the deaths that built your world are not erased from the story. St. Louis has, in its own way, done this. The town maintains Tom Dunn's story. School children learn about him. The Historical Society preserves what few records exist. The light itself is treated with respect rather than commercialized into kitsch. It's not much. It's not justice. Not really. Catherine Dunn never received compensation. The railway was never held accountable. The truth of Tom's death was never officially acknowledged. But it's something. It's memory. And memory, the light seems to insist, matters. Tom Dunn was not the only worker killed on the Canadian Northern Railway. He wasn't even the only one killed that year. The records that survive, incomplete, sanitized, often deliberately vague, document dozens of deaths: track workers crushed by derailed cars, brakemen who fell between couplings, engineers who died when boilers exploded, laborers who froze during winter work or succumbed to heat exhaustion in summer. Most of these men have no graves, no memorials, no ghost lights marking where they fell. They died, were buried quickly or not at all, and were forgotten. Their families scattered, their stories lost. Tom Dunn's light, then, represents not just his own death, but the deaths of all these forgotten workers. It's a memorial not just to one man's injustice, but to the systematic disregard for human life that characterized industrial development across North America. The railway companies like to present themselves as nation builders, engines of progress and prosperity, and, in a sense, they were. The railways did connect communities, enable trade, facilitate settlement. They were genuinely transformative, but transformation came at a cost measured in human lives. Every mile of track represented not just engineering and capital, but blood and bone. Workers died by the hundreds to lay those rails, to blast through rock, to bridge rivers, to maintain the system once it was built. These deaths were treated as inevitable, acceptable losses. The companies maintained that the work was inherently dangerous and that workers knew the risks when they signed on. This logic conveniently ignored the fact that workers had little choice: take dangerous work or starve, and that many of the deaths resulted from entirely preventable causes: inadequate safety equipment, pressure to work in unsafe conditions, deferred maintenance to save money. The workers understood this. They knew they were being sacrificed to corporate profit margins, but they had limited power to resist. Labor organizing was in its infancy. Strikes were often met with violence. Complaining could get you fired or blacklisted. So they died quietly, and the railways kept running, and the official histories celebrated the vision of the industrialists while barely mentioning the men who actually built the system with their hands and paid for it with their lives. Tom Dunn's light is a rebuke to this erasure. It insists that these deaths mattered, that these men were more than expendable components in an industrial machine. It forces us to remember that every achievement of the industrial age came at human cost, and that ignoring this cost doesn't make it any less real. By now, you may have noticed that we've spent much of this story talking around a central question. Is the St. Louis light actually Tom Dunn's ghost, or is it something else? The honest answer is, we don't know. We cannot know, not with the epistemological tools available to us. The phenomenon is real, Too many credible witnesses have observed it under conditions that preclude easy dismissal. But what it is, in ontological terms, remains mysterious. Perhaps it is Tom's ghost in some literal sense, the persistence of consciousness after death, bound to the location of his final moments by unresolved trauma or uncompleted purpose. Perhaps it's a collective psychic manifestation, the crystallization of community guilt and grief into a form that can be perceived sensorially. Perhaps it's a natural phenomenon we don't yet understand, one that happens to occur in a location saturated with historical meaning, and the human tendency toward narrative has shaped our interpretation of it. Or perhaps the distinction doesn't matter as much as we think it does. What the light means is more important than what it is, and what it means is clear. Some debts survive the grave, some injustices echo across generations, some truths refuse to stay buried. The light is a memorial that maintains itself, a story that tells itself, a reminder that appears whether we want it or not. It doesn't ask for belief or understanding. It simply is, night after night, year after year, decade after decade, a single point of pale illumination moving through the darkness, searching. In a culture that excels at forgetting, at moving on, at declaring the past irrelevant to the present, the light is radically subversive. It insists that the past is not dead. It's not even past, to borrow Faulkner's phrase. It's right here, walking the tracks, carrying its lantern, waiting for someone to finally see it clearly. We return at the end to where we began. The tracks outside St. Louis, on a cold night when the air is still and the darkness feels deeper than it should. The light is there. Not every night, not predictably, but often enough that patient observers can witness it. It moves with that same steady, purposeful gait. The walk of a man who knows these tracks intimately, who's traveled this route 1,000 times. What is it searching for? Justice, perhaps. Acknowledgement. Witnesses. Someone to finally tell the truth about what happened that night in August 1913. Or maybe it's not searching for anything external. Maybe the light itself is the justice, the only kind available when human systems fail. Maybe the haunting is the punishment, not for Tom Dunn, but for all of us. A reminder that we cannot build civilization on the broken bodies of workers and then forget they existed. Tom Dunn never received justice in any legal or financial sense. His death was never properly investigated. The railway was never held accountable. Catherine and Mary never received compensation or even an apology. But Tom was not forgotten. His story survives. His light persists. And in a world where power usually determines whose history gets told and whose suffering gets acknowledged, there's a certain poetic justice in the fact that a poor railway worker has achieved a kind of immortality that eluded the wealthy managers who dismissed his death. The railways that killed Tom Dunn are gone. The companies that covered up his death are dissolved. The managers who prioritize profit over human life are dust, but the light remains. On clear, cold nights, you can still go to St. Louis, Saskatchewan. You can walk the old railbed, stand where the tracks once lay, and wait. If you're patient, if the conditions are right, if whatever governs these things chooses to manifest, you'll see it, that pale yellowish glow, moving with steady purpose through the darkness. And if you're paying attention, really paying attention, you'll understand that you're not just seeing a ghost story or a paranormal phenomenon. You're witnessing a kind of memorial service that's been ongoing for more than a century. A service for all the workers who died, building the infrastructure we take for granted. For all the deaths deemed acceptable costs of progress. For all the families left to grieve without support or justice. The light is Tom Dunn. The light is also every worker who ever died, because profit mattered more than safety. Every person whose death was covered up to protect institutional reputations. Every family denied compensation because corporations wrote the rules that governed their own accountability. The light is history refusing to be forgotten. And it walks those tracks still, night after night, lantern held high, not in hope of justice that will never come, but as evidence that some debts endure, some debts outlast empires, some debts walk the darkness forever, patient and unrelenting, waiting for the living to finally see what they've spent generations trying to ignore, that every light we enjoy was bought with someone's suffering, that every comfort we take for granted costs someone their safety. That progress is written in blood, and the blood never completely washes away. Tom Dunn walks those tracks because we need him to. We need the reminder, we need the haunting. Because if we forget the cost of what we've built, we'll happily pay the same price again. We'll sacrifice new workers to new machines, generate new ghosts to walk new tracks, create new lights that will outlast us all. The St. Louis light is not just about one man's death in 1913. It's about what we do to each other in the name of progress, what we're willing to accept, what we allow ourselves to forget. And it suggests, in its quiet, persistent way, that the dead keep better accounts than the living. That history never truly forgives. That justice, even when it's denied, leaves a mark on the world, a cold light moving through the darkness, searching, always searching, refusing to rest. On the edge of a quiet Canadian town, where memory and darkness meet, that light still walks. And it will walk long after we're gone, long after this story is forgotten, long after St. Louis itself returns to prairie grass and silence. Because some debts are forever, and some ghosts never go home.